Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Angel and today I am sharing some DIYs that are not only decorative and pretty, but they are functional and useful. For this first project, I found this little mail organizer at my thrift store and it's a little old. Some of the little key hooks were missing and it had this cute little ceramic house decal on the front of it. So I definitely wanted to change this up a little bit to fit my style more. And I went over this probably 4 coats of my white chalk paint just to get the entire thing covered. It was a little bit difficult to get down in there where the mail slots are separated, and it probably would have been easier to just spray paint this. I actually thought about keeping the little ceramic house on there, but I did end up painting over it and I'm replacing it with this little scrapbook page that I got from Amazon. Everything I use in today's video will be linked below, but this piece just happened to say postal and had little mail stamp on it. So all I did was cut that down to fit, and then I used some of my glue stick to attach that. Now, I didn't want to do too much to this, but I did want to dress up the sides a little bit. So I'm using this stencil that I got from Amazon, which happened to fit perfectly down the sides of this with some of my antique gold paint, and I'm just stenciling the sides. And I know I do a lot of white decor, but my walls are actually green and I have really busy wallpaper. So I didn't want to do too much to this to make it clash with my paint or my wallpaper. But of course, as always, you can do these projects any color you would like. But finally for this project, I just added in some new gold hooks. For this project, I'm using one of these little Dollar Tree wood shelves. Now, you could definitely just use scrap pieces of wood for this, or if you have an old frame that you'd like to use, that is definitely a good option for this project as well. The first thing I'm going to do is sand this down using a fine grit side of my sanding block. Definitely make sure that you are sanding whatever piece of wood you are using really smooth, because we are going to add a chalkboard onto this. I'm using this chalkboard paint that I got from Dollar Tree, and it says it only needs 1 coat, but I did end up doing 2 coats just to make sure. I wasn't sure how good it was going to work. I've only used this chalkboard paint on smaller pieces, but I do think 1 coat would have worked just fine. Now, of course, I wanted this to be pretty, so I'm going to decorate this using these molds that I got from Amazon. These 3 molds came in a pack, and I'm going to kind of use all 3 of them, a mixture of pieces. For my smaller pieces and pieces I don't need to mold, I'm going to just use hot glue for those. And then for my larger pieces or pieces that I'm going to be molding to kind of make this decoration on the frame, I'm going to use my air dry clay, and as you can see, I just roll it out into my mold and then I just pull off the excess. Now, I kind of had an idea of what I was going to do with all these pieces, and you can see here, once I had all my pieces made, I just kind of made up the design. There was no rhyme or reason to how I did it, but I just used hot glue to glue down my hot glue molded pieces, and then I couldn't find my super glue, so I just used tacky glue on my clay pieces, and it was kind of just like putting a puzzle together. Like I said, I kind of had an idea of what I was doing, but really just kind of went with it and glued the pieces the way that I thought that they looked good. And I know it looks a little crazy right now and doesn't actually look the best, but I promise in the end, it is going to be super pretty. So once I had all my pieces glued down, I let that dry for a little while, and then I'm going to take some regular school glue and I'm going to put this all over the outside of the frame, not the inside, because that's where our chalkboard is going to be, but the outside is actually going to get a crackle paint job. You guys know I love this method. So once my glue dried for a little while, I'm taking my white chalk paint and I'm going over this with a heavy coat of that chalk paint, and I'm trying not to like double brush over it, but anywhere that there was like smaller areas that I couldn't get into, I used a small brush. And I just made sure that I painted the whole outside and all of those little molding pieces to match it so it looked like a faux frame. For this next project, I picked up this little box from my thrift store, and as you can see, it's a little damaged and a little worn. It even had a broken hinge, and it's definitely not my style, but I wanted to make this over into a cute little recipe box. So the first thing I had to do was take this all apart, which was no easy feat because all 8 of the screws for the hinges were not only painted over, but they were stripped, and then I also removed that rope and little float on top. Then I went in with some of my Waverly chalk paint and gave this 3 good coats of the paint. And once those 3 coats were finished, I wanted to, like I said, make this more my style. So I'm using one of these craft treat stencils that I get from Amazon. And I wanted to make this more vintage looking French cottage. So luckily this fit perfectly on this box. So here I am just taking some painter's tape and taping my stencil down. And then I grabbed some Dollar Tree spackling, added a few drops of water into this to make it more of a paste consistency, and then I used my little Cricut spatula from Dollar Tree and I am smoothing this all over that stencil. I like to say as a rule of thumb to make sure you cover your stencil completely, and then once you remove it you'll have a beautiful raised stencil. Now for the top of this, I did fill in those holes with some of that spackling, and then I'm again using that same stencil. And the great thing about this stencil is if you turn it around, it actually lines up with the top of the stenciling that you just did. So this ended up working out quite perfectly, and I just turned it around and did the same exact thing on the top. Now, before I put this all back together, I wanted to cover the inside of the lid. So I'm using some of this felt velvet paper that I get from Amazon, and it is self-adhesive. So all I had to do was just trace out the lid and then pop this onto the inside of that top piece. And that was really just to cover up those holes. Now, since the box had broken hinges, I'm actually just replacing them with these hinges. I got a big package of them from Amazon, and they come in different sizes, and this one happened to have the exact size of this box, so I just added that on there. Now once I had it all back together, I realized I wasn't a huge fan of how the edges just kind of stopped on here, and I felt like it just needed a little more detail and to finish it off. So I'm using some of my air dry clay and one of my Amazon silicone molds to make little edge pieces. I ended up having to do 3 of these to fit that bottom piece and then the lid as well. But as you can see, I just laid it down with some gel super glue, and then right there where the lid is, I cut that so that the top piece would kind of meet there and line up with the bottom piece. So as you can see, once I had the top piece glued down, there was still a little gap there at the very top, and that's where I used my third piece and just kind of cut that piece down to line up with those. I also wanted to add a handle back to the top of this, so I'm using this little drawer pull that I got from Home Depot. I picked up a bunch of these. They were on clearance and it was copper, but I ended up using some rub and buff on it. Then all I had to do was just drill down into the top of my lid and add this little handle. I also decided that I wanted to add a little tag on the front of this box that says recipes. So this is actually a little tag from a Dollar Tree picture frame that I just had in my stash. So I'm going to start by taking this little tag and using some of my European Gold Rub and Buff on it just to make it cohesive with the handle that I just put onto the box. Then before I put the tag on, I'm taking some more of that Rub and Buff with my stenciling brush, and I'm just going over this entire box, making sure that I really get those details. Then once I'm done with that, I am moving on to making that recipe tag. This is a piece of scrapbook paper. I got a whole bunch of these from Amazon. And then this is a rub-on transfer that I got from Dollar Tree. So I'm going to use the little piece that says recipes, and I'm just going to rub that onto my scrapbook paper. Then I just used the tag to trace around that so I could cut it down to fit the tag. And all I had to do was then add this to the front of my box. For this final project, I picked up this little cutting board from my thrift store, and as you can see, someone had already painted on it. So I did sand this down very lightly because I'm going to be using the back side of this actually anyway, so it didn't really matter if I sanded it completely down. Now I wanted to do a base coat of paint on this. White is actually not going to be the final color of this, so I'm just using a wet paintbrush and going over this entire cutting board, front, back, and sides, and then any excess on there, I'm just wiping it off because once again, like I said, this is not the final color. This is just a base color, and you'll see why I did this in just a little bit. But I guess basically right now I am just kind of whitewashing this just to brighten up that wood color. Now, as most of you may know, my grandmother recently passed away, and this book right here is actually a cookbook that my mom wrote for me, and it does have some of my grandma's recipes in here. So I thought this would be really cute to make into a piece of memorabilia or a family heirloom. So I'm taking my grandmother's chocolate pie recipe and I'm going to transfer it onto this cutting board. And this is really going to have double sentimental value to me because it's my grandmother's recipe, but it's written in my mom's handwriting. So there's a few ways that you can accomplish this to transfer handwriting onto this cutting board, but I am taking the easiest way and I'm using some of this carbon paper that I got from Amazon, and I'm going to tape that down to my cutting board so it's not moving around as I'm doing this. And then I'm using the little tool that came with my carbon paper and I'm just tracing over my mom's handwriting. And as you can see, once I take that carbon paper off, it has transferred my mom's handwriting and my grandma's recipe onto the cutting board. And then I took this outside and gave it 2 coats of my Aleene's acrylic sealer. Then once that was dry, I brought it back in and I decided I wanted to make a functional piece out of this. So I cut down one of Dollar Tree's little wood pieces to fit my cutting board so that I could turn this into a recipe book stand or a tablet stand. And I'm I'm just using a wet cloth and some of my burnt umber paint to stain that. Then I'm moving over to finish off the cutting board. Remember, I said the white was not going to be the final color, so I am taking that same wet cloth and some of that burnt umber, and I'm staining this wood piece to turn it back into wood, but a more softer wood color. And the reason I painted over this with white, as you can see, if you look at the cutting board and that little wood piece, burnt umber is a super dark color, and I didn't want it to cover up the writing, so I used the white as a base coat so that this cutting board would be a few shades lighter. And then I used some wood glue to attach that little wood piece to the front of the cutting board. I also added 2 screws into the back of this just to make sure that it holds nicely. Then I decided, of course, it needs a little front piece on that Dollar Tree wood piece so that your tablet or your recipe book can't fall over. So I'm using some of my air dry clay and my Amazon mold to make a little decorative front piece. And this piece was a tiny bit too big, so all I did was just lay it onto that wood piece and cut it down, and then set this aside to dry. Now I also wanted to add just a little decorative piece, so I'm taking this other Amazon mold that I had, using some of my hot glue and just making a cute little decorative piece for the top. Then once the clay was dry and I had that other little decorative piece done, I went in with some of that burnt umber and painted both of them. Now obviously, if I wanted to make this into a stand, I needed to put a little kickstand on the back of this. So I'm just using this other little wood piece that I got from Dollar Tree. And again, I'm using my burnt umber and my wet cloth to stain this piece of wood so that it matches. Then I'm again going to be using some of those Amazon hinges to attach this to the back of my cutting board. Then I was able to add on those decorative pieces just using some gel super glue to attach both of those pieces. And finally, I went in and went over this entire piece with some of my Waverly white wax to bring out that detail and seal everything in. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed these projects. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.